So, I want to start this with a question that we will connect back to at the end of this set of notes. And that was a question that's been studied throughout the pandemic. And that is simply, how does COVID-19 infect a cell? A human cell in particular. And I start with this before we get into some of the fundamentals of cellular biology, because I think it's really helpful to put this in the context of where we are at. This question, which has been researched since the beginning of this pandemic, relies heavily upon the field of cellular biology and our understanding of how cells work. So, as we look at kind of the fundamentals of cellular biology, we're going to keep this in mind, and we're going to apply some of the things we're going to talk about. So I'm going to put a little box around this for later. Okay. So in the field of cellular biology, there is what is known as the cell theory. Now, this theory, which is a set of ideas that has been developed over time and is supported by ample amounts of evidence. Yeah. Last call. What's that? O through Z. Go ahead and get your COVID test. Come back quickly. Don't worry, you'll get to rewatch this for anything you miss. All right. So this cell theory has three major components. The first component is the idea that all living organisms are composed of cells. Right? That is a fundamental portion of the cell theory, that all living organisms are composed of cells. Anything that's not made of cells is not living. However, they may be unicellular or multicellular. So there are some organisms, such as protists, that we'll talk about later in this unit, that are unicellular. They only are made up of one cell. But an organism like a human is composed of billions of cells, each with very specific functions. So that's the first major component of this theory. The second, along those lines, is that the cell is the basic unit of life. And what is meant by this is that there is nothing smaller than a cell that can perform the functions that are attributed to a living organism. Right? The smallest organism, in other words, is a unicellular organism. There's nothing smaller. Okay. And then third, the cell theory states that cells arise from pre-existing cells. Which is a pretty, at first glance, straightforward statement. But this component of the theory, the time when this theory was being developed and tested, actually went against what was the common theory back then, which was one of spontaneous generation, which suggested that living organisms could come from non-living organisms, or non-living things. They could spontaneously arise. And so this cell theory said that since the basic unit of life is a cell, that cell must have come from a different cell. A pre-existing cell can't have come from a non-living thing. Okay, with all these in mind, throughout this unit, we're going to see that there are many different types of cells that share some common traits, but they also have some unique features. So there are many types of cells. With different structures and functions. To name a few, you can draw an intestinal cell. So intestinal cells, which line your large intestine, your small intestine, look like this. And they're known particularly for their microvilli structures, these kind of finger-like structures that help with absorption. They provide lots of surface area by which the cell can absorb nutrients from the space inside of the intestine, the lumen. And you have a cell like that that looks very different from, say, a neuron. So a neuron has a structure that looks very different. It's known for its characteristic long, what's known as an axon, that allows for signals to be sent over long distances and communicated to other neurons. So we have a neuron. There you go, microvilli. Okay, and then lastly, you can have something as simple as a bacteria. It might have a little bit of DNA present. Has a very straightforward structure. The point is being that across the field of biology, there is a vast range of what cells look like, what cells' major functions are. But what I also want to make the point of, So a little bit louder for me. These are just 3 examples to start us off, but there are so many more different types of cells. These aren't like the 3 major categories. These are just 3 examples. Yeah. Okay. But while there are many different types of cells, the point that I want to make here is that there are common characteristics or common traits that all cells have. So while they're different, there are some common traits of all cells. The first being that cells have a membrane which separates the internal environment from the external environment. Number 2, all cells contain some kind of genetic information which stores the info needed to control main functions. So we'll talk about how that actually occurs in our second unit. Third, all cells carry out chemical reactions typically using enzymes that the cell produces. All cells have membranes. They all have genetic information. They all carry out chemical reactions that use enzymes. And then lastly, all cells have an energy release system. And these are reactions specifically that release energy from nutrients to power the cell's functions. Fancy term that we use for this is metabolism. So there are metabolic reactions that function as an energy release system that power all of the cell's functions that it carries out. Okay, so when we are going to study all the different types of cells, categories of organisms, while there are lots of different types of cells and lots of different structures, they all share these 4 characteristics. Okay, any questions so far? Okay. Yeah. Metabolism. right, so the last piece of kind of background information before we get to our question here about COVID-19. I want to talk about, in addition to the cell theory, what has been described as the main criteria for all living organisms. So we already stated one of them, right, that all living organisms are composed of cells, since the smallest organism, right, is a unicellular organism. But in addition to that, there's a couple of criteria that all living organisms share. Just like all of these traits are shared by all cells, these criteria are shared by all living organisms. The first of which, again, is that they are made of at least one cell or multiple cells. The second is that all living organisms are able to respond to what we call stimuli. And what that means is that a living organism has to be able to react to changes in the environment. That's part of being a living organism, is being able to respond when your environment changes. So adapt, we'll get into in a future unit. Adapt is specifically used to describe when random genetic changes occur that introduce a specific advantage to some individuals in the population that then become more common over time. By response to stimuli, I'm talking about like immediately in response to a change. Like if the temperature drops, right? A living organism responds in some way, either by mechanisms that allow them to maintain their internal body temperature, or mechanisms that help them to slow down particular processes to conserve energy, right? It's that kind of response. But good clarifying question. This is not referring to adaptation. Okay. Number 3. All living organisms require some nutrition. In other words, they have to obtain some type of food or other type of nutrition, since they have that energy release system that allows them to power the cell's functions. So they have to have some type of nutrition that they use. Okay. Number 4, all living organisms have to be able to reproduce, either asexually or sexually. To be able to reproduce, since one of the assumptions of the cell theory is that cells arise from pre-existing cells. So there has to be, for the smallest organism, an ability to reproduce. Okay. And just a couple more here. The 5th characteristic or criteria for all living organisms is they have to be able to carry out metabolic reactions. They have to be able to, by their cell, like by what's contained in the cell, they have to be able to carry out metabolic reactions on their own. Since metabolic reactions, right, again, are this energy release to power the rest of their functions. Yeah. What's that? Asexually? Yeah, so at this point, we don't need to know specifically the difference between them. I'll just kind of put that as a connection we're going to draw from later in the year. The quick version is asexual produces two identical options. So think like bacteria, they do something called binary fission, where they split from one bacteria into two. They're both identical. That's asexual reproduction, whereas sexual reproduction involves the use of gametes, so sperm and egg, that have unique genetic combinations that fuse to produce a genetically unique offspring. That's genetically different from each parent. Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Like any organisms, when they reproduce and that when it's time to divide, it's a lot slower, and their ability to adapt is a lot higher than that of asexual reproduction. But we'll get to number 6. All living organisms have to show signs in their lifespan. Have to be able to maintain. Right now is considering the word maintain. This just means down. So what we've talked 3 components of this, that being that in the field of cellular smaller, that's alive cells. Then we've turned our attention to, we've identified outside, they have genetic information, food or nutrition. Cellular, they share these stages as necessary. Use. 6, to survive. Is there anything that you want me to? Could you elaborate a little bit?